Chapter 1. The Door Left Open. There are villages in England that seem to exist outside the ordinary passage of time, and Little Poldean was, by universal agreement, one of them. It lay in a fold of the Kentish Downs like a coin dropped carelessly into the grass, its cottages leaning companionably toward one another along a single curving lane, its church tower rising above the elms with the patient, unhurried dignity of something that has watched several centuries go by and expects to watch several more. On a fine September evening, with the light turning the colour of weak honey and the rooks settling themselves into the churchyard limes with a great deal of unnecessary conversation, it was almost impossible to believe that anything more dramatic than a dispute over the flower rota could ever disturb its peace. Miss Jane Marple, who had come down from St. Mary Mead to spend a fortnight with her old school friend Dolly Bantry, now removed to a smaller house since the Colonel's passing, though she had insisted on bringing an alarming quantity of garden furniture with her, sat in the vicarage garden that evening with her knitting idle in her lap, and found herself, not for the first time, listening rather more than she was being spoken to. "He never locks it, you know," Dolly was saying, with the particular relish of someone imparting a piece of local colour to a visitor. "The vicarage door never has, not in all the years he's been here. Michael says a locked door is a kind of accusation, that it tells a caller you've already decided to think the worst of them before they've said a word." She laughed, a comfortable, unthinking sound. "The village adores him for it. Old Mrs. Pettigrew says it's the mark of a true Christian. I dare say it's rather more likely to be the mark of a man who's never had anything worth stealing." Miss Marple smiled in the way that made people believe she was merely being agreeable, and said nothing at all, though something in her, some small, quiet instrument that had been finely calibrated over a long lifetime of observing human nature in a very small pond, had already begun, almost imperceptibly, to hum. It was not that there was anything sinister in an open door, quite the reverse. It was the sort of gesture that ought to have been entirely reassuring, and yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the things people did publicly, as a kind of moral advertisement, were very often the things that cost them the most privately. A door left open to the whole world was, after all, a door that could never quite be closed against any one person in particular, and she wondered, watching a swallow cut low across the darkening lawn, whether the Reverend Michael Ashworth had ever once, in the stillness of his own study, wished that he could close it. She had noticed him earlier, at evensong. He had a kind face, the vicar, gentle, a little tired about the eyes, the face of a man who had spent 30 years listening to other people's confessions, and had grown, perhaps, permanently, a little bowed under the accumulated weight of them. He had read the lesson well, in a voice that carried without straining, and yet twice during the service Miss Marple had observed his gaze travel, quite involuntarily, toward the back pew where Diana Wren sat with her hands folded and her chin lowered in the attitude of perfect, unremarkable piety. There was nothing whatever remarkable in a housekeeper attending her employer's church, and yet the vicar's glance had not been the glance of a man checking that his household was present and correct. It had been quicker than that, and heavier, the glance of a man who is trying not to look at something, and failing. Diana Wren herself was a woman of perhaps 45, neat, quiet, capable, the sort of woman whom villages absorb so thoroughly into their machinery that they cease, after a time, to be noticed at all, which was, Miss Marple privately reflected, rather a curious thing in itself, since the truly unremarkable so rarely troubled to be quite so careful about it. Her hands, folded in her lap that evening, had not moved once during the entire hymn. "You're very quiet, Jane," said Dolly, refilling the teacups with the brisk inattention of long friendship. "Am I, dear? I was only thinking what a very lovely evening it is," said Miss Marple, which was true, and also not at all the whole of what she had been thinking. The light failed slowly, the way it does in the last mild days before autumn properly asserts itself, and the two women sat on until the midges drove them indoors, and the lamps were lit in the windows of the village one by one, small warm squares against the coming dark, and somewhere beyond the churchyard wall the vicarage stood, as it always stood, its door, as it always was, unlocked. It was old Mrs. Trent, arriving before 8 the next morning with a basket of altar flowers, who found him. The vicar was seated at his study desk, exactly as he might have been seated 100 ordinary evenings before, his reading spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, a sherry glass standing empty at his elbow, and his kind, tired face turned toward the window, as though he had simply paused, mid-thought, to watch the last light go out of the sky, and had never, in the end, thought to move again. Chapter 2. A village in mourning grief, Miss Marple had long observed, arrives in a village very much as weather does, sweeping in from some point beyond the hedgerows, altering the light, and settling over every rooftop with a democratic impartiality that has nothing whatever to do with how well any particular household actually knew the deceased. By 9 o'clock that morning, the news had travelled from Mrs. Trent's basket of altar flowers to the baker's, from the baker's to the post office, and from the post office, by means Miss Marple had never troubled to investigate, but had long ago accepted as one of the immutable laws of English village life, to every cottage window from the green to the water meadows, so that by the time she and Dolly walked down as far as the Lich Gate, the whole of Little Poldean already wore the peculiar, hushed excitement of a community that has been handed a tragedy and does not yet know whether it is permitted to enjoy it. "Hard," said Mrs. Pettigrew, waylaying them by the war memorial with the swiftness of a woman who has been lying in wait. "That's what Dr. Haydock's saying, though of course he'd say that, wouldn't he? Until he's had a proper look. Poor lamb. 61, and never a day's illness that anyone knew of." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that had clearly not yet had occasion to be used for its purpose, and added, with scarcely a change of tone, "And who's to have the living now? That's what I want to know. Not that dreadful young man from Maidstone, I hope." Miss Marple made the sort of murmuring reply that commits one to nothing, and privately reflected that grief in a small place is rarely permitted to remain simple grief for very long. It is almost immediately obliged to make room for logistics and speculation, and the small, human, faintly shameful business of wondering what will happen next, and to whom. It was Dolly, ever practical, who suggested they call at the vicarage that afternoon. "Not to intrude, Jane, only it would look very odd if we didn't. And besides, someone ought to see whether that poor Wren woman needs a hand with things." And so it was that Miss Marple found herself, by 4 o'clock, seated once again in a room she had occupied only the day before, under such entirely different circumstances, drinking tea poured by hands that did not shake, from a woman whose composure was, upon reflection, really rather extraordinary. The vicarage drawing-room had already begun to fill with the small procession of the concerned. The curate, young Mr. Faulkner, hovering near the door, with the stricken uselessness of a man who has never before been required to manage a crisis without someone senior to defer to. The churchwarden, Major Hartnell, discussing with grim relish the arrangements for the funeral as though it were a parade to be organized. 2 or 3 ladies of the parish council murmuring together over the sandwiches. And moving among them all, unobtrusive, endlessly capable, was Diana Wren. Such a treasure, Mrs. Pettigrew said to Miss Marple in an undertone, watching Diana refill a teapot with quiet, economical movements. I don't know how the poor man would have managed without her these 15 years. Never a cross word, never a day off that anyone remembers. Devoted to him, you know. Quite devoted. He always said she ran that house better than he ran his own life. She gave a small, sentimental sigh. It's her I feel for, really. What's to become of her now, I wonder, with him gone? Miss Marple, who had learned very early in life that the things people say about a person in the third person, in that person's own house, on the day after a death, are frequently more revealing of the speaker's assumptions than of any actual truth, merely watched. She watched Diana Wren move from the tea tray to the mantelpiece to straighten, with a small and unnecessary gesture, a photograph that did not need straightening. She watched her accept condolences with a bowed head and a murmured word of thanks that was, in its precise repetition, to each mourner in turn, almost liturgical in its economy. She watched her hands, capable hands, reddened a little from work, entirely steady, and she thought, not for the first time in her long life, how very much can be learned from the hands of a woman who has trained her face into perfect stillness. For it was the face that troubled her, in the end, more than anything else. Diana Wren's countenance, throughout that long and difficult afternoon, expressed exactly what it ought to have expressed: sorrow, restraint, a housekeeper's proper grief for a good master, tempered by the necessity of seeing to the practical comfort of his mourners. It was in every particular correct. And it was this very correctness that caught, like a small burr, upon some old and well-worn part of Miss Marple's mind. For she had noticed, over some 70 years of watching human beings conduct themselves at moments of genuine feeling, that real grief is rarely so tidy. It trips over itself. It forgets, for a moment, to pour the tea. It is interrupted by a sudden and undignified sob at the sight of a familiar coat still hanging on its accustomed hook. Diana Wren's grief, by contrast, moved through the room with the same quiet efficiency with which she might have moved through her Tuesday marketing, and there was something in that efficiency, something Miss Marple could not yet have named, even to herself, that felt less like the absence of feeling than like feeling held very tightly indeed, in both hands, for fear of what might happen were it to be set down. "Miss Wren," she said gently, when the room had thinned a little, and she found herself, by no very great contrivance, standing near enough the tea-tray to speak without being overheard. "You must be quite exhausted. 15 years is a very long time to be so close to a household. I imagine one comes to feel almost a part of the family." Something crossed Diana Wren's face then, so brief, so immediately smoothed over that Miss Marple would not have been able to swear to it in a court of law, though she would have staked a good deal of her own certainty upon it privately. It was not grief. It was something closer, Miss Marple thought, to the flinch of a woman who has been touched, quite unknowingly, upon an old bruise. "One does one's duty, Miss Marple," Diana said, and her voice was perfectly even. "The Reverend was a kind employer. I shall miss him." And then, before anything further could be said, she had turned to attend to the vicar's sister, newly arrived and weeping in the hall, and the moment, whatever it had been, closed over as smoothly as water. It was some while later, as the light began to fail, and the last of the mourners were gathering their coats and murmuring their final condolences in the hall, that Miss Marple, having gone in search of a cloakroom and lost her way somewhat in the unfamiliar passages of the vicarage, a small deception she was not, upon reflection, entirely ashamed of, found herself passing the half-open door of the study. She ought not, of course, to have looked in, but the room drew her, as such rooms always did. The last room a man occupies before he ceases, entirely, to occupy anything at all, and she paused a moment on the threshold, taking in its ordinary, undisturbed particulars. The desk, still bearing the faint indentation where his elbow must so often have rested, the shelves of sermons and county histories, a single sherry glass, now empty and standing a little apart from the decanter, which someone, Dr. Haydock presumably, or the constable who had been sent for, had not yet thought to remove. And it was there, in the failing light, that she saw Diana Wren. The housekeeper stood at the vicar's desk with her back half turned to the door, and for one unguarded moment, the only unguarded moment Miss Marple was to observe in her that entire long afternoon, her careful composure had entirely deserted her. Her shoulders were drawn up tight. Her breathing, even at that distance, seemed audible. She was bent low over the desk drawer, and as Miss Marple watched, quite without meaning to be watching anything at all, Diana Wren's hand closed swiftly around some small object lying within it. Miss Marple could not, in the poor light and at that distance, make out precisely what, and slipped it, in a single quick and practised movement, into the pocket of her apron. Then she straightened, smoothed her skirts with both hands, and turned toward the door with a face once more entirely, perfectly composed, so composed indeed that had Miss Marple not seen what she had just seen, she would have sworn that nothing at all had passed in that room but the ordinary business of a grieving woman tidying her late employer's things. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple," Diana said, with only the faintest, courteous incline of the head. "I was just seeing that nothing was disturbed before the constable arrives. One likes everything to be in order." "Of course," said Miss Marple, "one always does." But as she made her way back, at last, to the drawing-room and accepted her coat from Dolly with murmured thanks, she found she was thinking not of the sherry glass, nor of the sermons on the shelf, nor even of poor Michael Ashworth's kind, tired face, but of a woman's hand closing swiftly around something small and private in a dead man's drawer, and of the particular, deliberate silence with which it had disappeared. Chapter 3. The Scent of Almonds. It was young Mr. Faulkner, of all people, who set the whole terrible business in motion. Mr. Faulkner, the curate, whose chief qualifications for his post seemed to Miss Marple to consist of a good singing voice, and an earnest, puppyish desire to be of use to somebody, and who had not, until that Thursday, shown the slightest capacity for altering the course of events in Little Poldean or anywhere else. It happened at the inquest, which had been arranged with what Dolly considered indecent haste for the Thursday following the vicar's death, in the small back room of the Blue Boar that did service, on such occasions, as a coroner's court. Miss Marple attended, as she attended most things in villages not her own, in the character of an elderly visitor with nothing better to do. A character she had found, over a great many years, to be almost infinitely useful, since nobody troubles to guard their tongue or their countenance before a harmless old lady with her knitting. Dr. Haydock, not her own Dr. Haydock of St. Mary Mead, but a younger, brisker practitioner of the same name, and evidently no relation, who had attended the vicar in his final illness and been the first to examine him after death, had given his evidence in the comfortable, unhurried manner of a man confirming what everyone already expected to hear. A weak heart, long suspected, finally giving out under the ordinary strain of a busy parish life. It was, Miss Marple thought, watching the room settle into a general and premature relief, precisely the sort of verdict a village wishes to hear, because it requires nothing further of anyone, no suspicion, no accusation, no uncomfortable reappraisal of neighbours one has known for years. Death by natural causes closes a door as effectively as any vicar's had ever stood open. It was at this point that young Mr. Faulkner, sitting near the back with the stricken, anxious look he had worn since Sunday, rose rather unsteadily to his feet and asked, in a voice that cracked slightly with the effort of speaking at all, whether it was quite usual for a weak heart to leave a smell of bitter almonds on a dead man's breath. The silence that followed was, Miss Marple reflected afterward, one of the most instructive she had ever had occasion to witness. It was not the silence of a room absorbing a piece of information. It was the silence of a room recognizing, all at once, that the story it had already agreed to tell itself was about to be taken away. "I only mention it," Faulkner went on, growing pinker and more miserable with every word, "because I was the one who found him first. That is, Mrs. Trent called me before the doctor could be got, and I sat with him a little while, you understand, before anyone else came, and I noticed it distinctly. I thought at the time it was marzipan. There'd been a fete only the week before, and I know Mrs. Trent's Battenberg." He stopped, aware that he was making himself faintly ridiculous, and sat down again with the air of a man who has said either something very important or something very foolish, and cannot for the life of him tell which. Dr. Haydock, to his credit, did not dismiss it. He was, Miss Marple thought, a decent sort of man, if a little too fond of the easy answer, and something in the curate's evident distress seemed to prick at his professional conscience. There was a good deal of murmured consultation, and the inquest was, in the end, adjourned, a phrase which fell upon the assembled village with the particular chill of a door that had seemed, only moments before, safely and finally shut, now swinging open again on its hinges. It was 3 days later, walking back from the churchyard where she had gone, ostensibly, to admire the late roses on Mrs. Bantry's late husband's grave, that Miss Marple encountered Dr. Haydock the younger by the Lich Gate, and found him, rather to her surprise, willing to speak more freely than professional discretion generally allowed. "Cyanide," he said, without much preamble, in the manner of a man who has been turning a thing over so long in private that he is almost relieved to say it aloud to someone. "In the sherry. Not very much, But then it doesn't take very much, does it? And a man with a heart already under strain wouldn't need a large dose to finish him. I ought to have caught it sooner. I dare say I would have, if the whole village hadn't been so very determined to tell me it was his heart before I'd even opened my bag. He looked at her sideways, with the frank curiosity of a younger man assessing an older woman he suspects of being sharper than she appears. You don't seem surprised, Miss Marple. I am very rarely surprised, Doctor, said Miss Marple placidly, though I am quite often disturbed, which I find to be a rather different sensation. One learns at my age that people are so seldom what the story wishes them to be. And a village, you know, is always terribly anxious to have its stories settled quickly, because an unsettled story is such an uncomfortable thing to live inside. She did not add, for it was not yet the sort of thought she could properly have defended to another person, only the sort she could carry quietly in her own mind, turning it this way and that, as one might turn a stone found in a garden bed, uncertain yet whether it was merely a stone or the fragment of something older and more deliberately shaped, that she was thinking of a woman's hand closing around some small object in a dead man's drawer, and of a face that had shown, for one unguarded instant, not grief but fear. The village, once the word poison had been permitted to enter its collective vocabulary, altered with astonishing speed. Suspicion, Miss Marple had observed on any number of previous occasions, is a curiously levelling emotion. Within a day of the news becoming general, half of Little Poldean had begun looking sideways at the other half, and old friendships that had endured 30 years of shared church fates and mutual borrowing of garden shears found themselves, quite suddenly, freighted with a new and uncomfortable weight. Major Hartnell was heard to remark, rather too loudly at the Blue Boar, that he'd never trusted that nephew of the vicar's, not since the business over the trust fund. Mrs. Pettigrew, calling upon Dolly with a basket of plums she did not in the least require to deliver, spent the better part of an hour speculating as to whether the vicar might have known something about somebody, and been silenced for it, though she was careful, in the manner of village gossips everywhere, never to specify precisely whom she meant, so that the accusation might be withdrawn, if necessary, without ever quite having been made. It was Dolly, in fact, who, quite without meaning to be useful, for she was rarely more than accidentally so, supplied Miss Marple with the piece of information that was to occupy her thoughts for a good many days afterward. "The strangest thing," Dolly said, over their sherry that evening, a sherry Miss Marple noticed she herself drank rather more sparingly than usual, though she could not have said precisely why. The old Colonel Whitfield's housekeeper was telling Mrs. Pettigrew, you know the Colonel, up at the Grange, dreadfully ill, poor man, the doctors don't give him above a few months. Well, it seems Michael went up there Tuesday evening, the very evening he died, and stayed above an hour, which is most unusual, because the Colonel's hardly fit to receive visitors at all these days. And when he came away, the housekeeper says he looked, how did she put it, unburdened, as though he'd set down something very heavy indeed. Unburdened, Miss Marple repeated softly, and something in the small, quiet instrument of her mind, which had been humming faintly since that first evening in the vicarage garden, sharpened all at once into something very near a chime. "And what time, Dolly dear, did the vicar return home that night?" "Not till gone 9, I believe, which would have given him only an hour or two before." Dolly stopped and set down her glass with a small, uncomfortable click. "Jane," You don't think the Colonel— I think, said Miss Marple, gazing out at the darkening garden with an expression of perfectly deceptive mildness, that a man who visits a dying friend and comes away unburdened has generally either confessed something himself or been told something he has long wished to hear, and that either possibility, Dolly, is a very great deal more interesting than a nephew's grievance over a trust fund. She paused and added, almost to herself, I wonder very much what Michael Ashworth carried up to the Grange that evening, and whether he carried anything at all away from it in return. Chapter 4. The Colonel's Confession. The Grange stood a mile beyond the village proper, at the end of an avenue of limes that had been planted, according to Dolly, by the Colonel's grandfather, in some long-forgotten fit of dynastic optimism, and which now met overhead in a dim green tunnel through which the afternoon light fell in broken, restless coins. It was, Miss Marple thought, arriving on the pretext of delivering a jar of Dolly's quince jelly, a pretext so thin she was rather ashamed of it, though not so ashamed as to abandon it. Exactly the sort of house that had once been built to declare a family's permanence to the world, and was now, in its slightly unravelling ivy and its unswept front steps, quietly declaring the opposite. She was received, after some little delay, by a housekeeper of advanced years, and a manner suggesting she had long ago given up expecting visitors to be anything but an imposition, and shown into a morning room where a fire burned rather too high for the mild afternoon, and where Colonel Whitfield sat in a wing chair with a rug over his knees, looking, Miss Marple thought, like a man who has been very handsome once and finds the fact almost insulting now. Mrs. Bantry's friend, he said, when the introductions had been made, in the flat, testing tone of a man deciding how much trouble a visitor is likely to be. You've come about the Vicar, I suppose. Everyone has, this past week. As if I could tell them anything the doctors haven't already told me twice over. His eyes, pale and sharp, despite the evident wreck of the rest of him, moved over her with a wariness Miss Marple recognized at once, having seen it so often before on the faces of people who have something to protect and have not yet decided whether the harmless-looking old woman before them is a danger to it. "I've come about the quince jelly, Colonel," said Miss Marple mildly, setting the jar upon the table beside him, "though I own I shan't pretend to be entirely surprised if the conversation wanders elsewhere. Villages are dreadfully bad at staying on one subject, don't you find? Everything seems to lead back, eventually, to everything else." Something flickered behind the pale eyes. Not quite alarm, but its close cousin, the wariness of a man testing a floor he suspects may not bear his weight. "You'll forgive me if I don't feel much like conversation these days, Miss Marple. I'm told I haven't a great deal of time left for it, and a man in my position finds his patience for chatter considerably reduced." He said this with a bitterness that seemed to Miss Marple only partly directed at his own approaching mortality, and partly at something else entirely, some older, more specific grievance that had settled into him long before the doctors had given him a date to attach it to. "I am so very sorry," said Miss Marple, with a gentleness that was not in the least assumed, for she had sat with a good many dying men and women in her time, and had never yet found the fact of it anything but genuinely sorrowful, whatever else might also be true. "It is a hard thing, I think, to be given warning of one's own end. Harder, in some ways, than not being given it at all, for it leaves one with so very much time to consider all the things one might have done differently and so very little time left to do them in. She had not intended the remark as anything but ordinary human kindness, offered to a dying man by a woman old enough to have earned the right to speak of such matters plainly. But she saw at once, from the way the Colonel's hand tightened upon the arm of his chair, that it had landed somewhere a great deal more precise than she had aimed for. "You knew him, Ashworth." It was not quite a question, only a very little. I had the pleasure of hearing him preach once or twice, and thought him a kind man. The whole village thinks so, I believe, without exception. She paused, and added, with the air of one merely continuing an idle train of thought, rather than pursuing anything so purposeful as an inquiry, "I understand he called on you the evening he died. It must have been a comfort, I should think, to have a visit from one's vicar at such a time, though I imagine it must also, in its way, have been rather a strain. These pastoral visits so often are, when there is a great deal on one's mind that one has never found the occasion to say aloud." The Colonel was silent for a long moment, and in that silence Miss Marple watched his face undergo a series of small, private struggles, the face, she thought, of a man who has spent years constructing a wall around some particular room in himself, and who has just been asked, by a stranger, with perfect and devastating gentleness, whether the door to that room might not, after all, still be standing ajar. "He came," the Colonel said at last. His voice dropped low. "Because I asked him to. I hadn't the strength left to carry it alone any further, and a dying man is entitled, I think, to set down at least one of his burdens before the end, whatever it costs him to do it." He turned his face toward the fire, and Miss Marple saw, with something very like pity, that his eyes had filled. "There was a child, Miss Marple, 45 years ago, very nearly. A girl, the daughter of a woman in this village, long dead now, God rest her, who deserved a very great deal better than what I gave her." His hands, resting on the rug, trembled slightly. "I was young, and a coward, and I let another man's kindness cover over what should have been my own responsibility to bear. The child was given up, quietly, decently, so far as such things can ever be decent, and I told myself, for 45 years, that I had done the only thing that could be done, and that the telling of it now could serve no purpose but to make an old man feel better at someone else's expense." He stopped, and pressed a hand briefly to his eyes, and Miss Marple, watching him, felt the small, sharp instrument in her own mind settle at last into something like certainty. Not yet the whole shape of the thing, but the outline of it, dark and unmistakable, the way a headland reveals itself through fog only by the gradual thickening of a single shadow. "I asked Michael to help me find her," the Colonel said. "Before I go, not to claim her, I've no right to that, not after 45 years of silence, only to know that she is well, and perhaps, if she would permit it, to make some small provision for her before the end, since God knows I never made any provision for her at the beginning." He looked up at Miss Marple then, and his pale eyes were very bright. "He told me he thought he could find her without very much difficulty at all. He said," the Colonel's voice caught, and steadied, and caught again. "He said she was closer to me than I knew, and that he intended to see the whole matter set right very soon, in his own way and in his own time, for everyone's sake. He left here that evening looking, I thought, almost relieved, as though a very old debt were at last about to be paid." He drew a long, unsteady breath. and by the next morning he was dead, and whatever he meant to do, whatever he knew, has died with him, and I am left no wiser than I was before, except that I have confessed my cowardice to a corpse's memory, instead of to the daughter I never had the courage to claim." Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, while the fire cracked and settled in the grate, and the Colonel wept, quietly and without shame, in the manner of very old men who have at last set down something they have carried for the whole of their adult lives. And into the silence that followed, quite unbidden, came the image, sharp now and entirely unwelcome, of a housekeeper's hand closing swiftly around some small object in a dead man's drawer, of a face schooled into perfect composure that had, for one unguarded instant, shown something closer to fear than to grief, of a woman of 45 who had come to Little Poldean some 15 years before from nowhere anyone could quite remember, and had made herself, in that time, so thoroughly and deliberately unremarkable that the whole village had ceased entirely to wonder where she had come from at all. "Colonel Whitfield," Miss Marple said, very gently, though her heart had begun, most unaccountably, to beat a good deal faster than the mild social occasion of a quince jelly delivery could possibly account for. "May I ask, do you happen to know whether the mother of your child gave her any name before the adoption was arranged? Any name at all that you can remember?" The Colonel looked at her, puzzled by the sudden particularity of the question, and passed a trembling hand across his brow, as though reaching back across 45 years for something long buried. "Diana," he said at last. "She wanted to call her Diana. Why do you ask?" Chapter 5. The Nephew's Grievance. She had said nothing further to the Colonel, had murmured only that it was, she supposed, a very pretty name, and had taken her leave shortly afterward with a gentleness that concealed, she hoped successfully, the extraordinary tumult into which his answer had thrown her. And it was not until she was walking back down the long avenue of limes, with the afternoon light falling in its broken coins about her feet, that she permitted herself to consider, fully and without flinching, what she had just been told. Diana. It was, of course, nothing more than a name, and a common enough one. There were, she did not doubt, a dozen women of that name within 20 miles of Little Poldean, and it would be the height of foolishness, the very sort of foolishness she had spent a long lifetime cautioning younger, more impetuous minds against, to leap from a single coincidence to a certainty. And yet there was the matter of the housekeeper's hand closing about something small and private in a dead man's drawer. There was the matter of a face schooled into perfect composure that had, for one unguarded instant, shown fear rather than grief. There was the matter, above all, of a woman who had arrived in the village some 15 years before, from nowhere anyone could quite remember, and who had made herself, in the whole of that time, so entirely and deliberately unremarkable that no one had ever troubled to wonder where, precisely, she had come from, or why. It was not proof, it was not even, strictly speaking, evidence, in the sense that a policeman might have understood the word. But Miss Marple had long ago concluded that the human heart does not arrange itself according to the tidy requirements of evidence, and that a coincidence, examined closely enough and set beside enough small ill-fitting observations, very often turns out to be no coincidence at all, but the visible edge of a pattern that has been there, quietly, the whole time, waiting only for someone patient enough to notice its shape. She was still turning the matter over, with the particular unhurried thoroughness she brought to all such problems, when she arrived back at Dolly's to find the drawing-room occupied by a young man she had not previously met, sprawled in the best armchair with the sort of careless proprietary ease that suggested either very great confidence or very great desperation, and frequently, in Miss Marple's experience, both together. "Simon Ashworth," Dolly said, with the faint, apologetic grimace of a hostess who has been landed with a guest she did not precisely invite. "The vicar's nephew. He's come down for the funeral, and to see the solicitor, and I believe," this in an undertone, as she drew Miss Marple aside on the pretext of the tea-tray, "to make a very great fuss about the will, though I'm sure I don't know why he imagines that's a suitable subject, before the poor man's even in the ground." Simon Ashworth was perhaps 30, dark, good-looking in the slightly worn way of a man who has traded a good deal of his early promise for something less defined, and possessed of the restless, faintly aggrieved energy of someone who has spent a long time believing the world owes him a correction it has not yet troubled to make. He rose when Miss Marple entered, with a charm that arrived a half-second too late to be entirely natural, and said, "You'll forgive me, I'm sure. Mrs. Bantry's told me you're something of a detective, in an amateur way. I don't suppose you've formed any views yet on who did for my uncle." "I am not at all a detective, Mr. Ashworth," said Miss Marple placidly, taking the chair he offered her. "Only a very old woman with a great deal of time on her hands, and a regrettable habit of noticing things that are really none of my business. I am so very sorry for your loss." "Are you?" He said it without particular rancour, but with a bluntness that made Dolly stiffen slightly in her chair. "I don't know that I am, entirely, and I'd rather say so plainly than pretend otherwise, since half this village seems determined to canonize the man now he's dead, and I knew him rather better than that. He was kind enough, in his way, but he'd a very convenient sort of kindness, generous with his time and his sympathy, and remarkably close-fisted with anything that might actually have cost him something." He said this with the particular bitterness of an old grievance too often rehearsed to have lost any of its sharpness with repetition. "My father was his younger brother. When he died, I was 19, my mother already gone. Uncle Michael took me in for precisely as long as it suited the parish's opinion of him to do so, and put me out into the world the very week I came of age, with a Bible and a good deal of advice, and not one penny that might actually have been of use to me. I've spent 12 years making my own way since, while he sat here in his comfortable living, dispensing charity to the whole village and none whatever to his own family." "And the will?" Miss Marple asked, gently enough, though she watched him closely as she said it. "The solicitor tells me I'm mentioned," Simon said, with a short, unamused laugh, "which is more than I expected, and rather less than I think I'm owed. There's some small legacy, nothing to signify, not by the standards of what this living's brought in over the years, though God knows where the rest of it's gone, since he never spent anything on himself that I could see." His jaw tightened. "I wrote to him, you know, not 2 months ago. Asked for a loan. Not charity, a loan, to be repaid in full, and had back a letter so full of gentle Christian counsel about the virtues of patience and thrift that I very near threw it on the fire. I'll confess I said some things in my reply I'm not proud of now. Things a man says in temper that read a good deal worse on paper afterward than they felt at the time of writing them." He looked up, and for the first time something genuine showed through the practiced grievance, something that might, in a kinder light, have been grief after all. "I don't imagine that improves my position, does it, in the eyes of the local constabulary? An angry letter, a disappointed nephew, a will read within the fortnight." "It does not, I think, improve it," Miss Marple agreed with the same gentleness, "though I have generally found, Mr. Ashworth, that a man who says a great deal too much about his own grievances, quite openly, to a stranger he has only just met, is rather less often the guilty party than the sort of man who says almost nothing at all, and says it very carefully." She paused, watching him. "Was that letter of yours ever found among your uncle's papers, do you know? The angry one, that you say you're not proud of?" Simon frowned, seeming to consider this for the first time. "I couldn't say. I'd have thought it might turn up, if the police have been through his desk." He stopped, and something uneasy crossed his face. "Why do you ask?" "Only," said Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap with an air of perfect tranquillity that concealed, as it so often did, a mind working very rapidly indeed, "that it seems to me a very great pity, when a man is dead and cannot explain himself, that the wrong letter should so easily be made to speak in place of the truth." It was 2 days later, the funeral having intervened, a grey and crowded affair, at which half the village wept with what Miss Marple privately considered a rather more theatrical grief than they had shown at the time of the death itself. That Constable Palk called at Dolly's cottage, in some evident state of suppressed excitement, to inform Miss Marple, since it appeared she had taken an interest in the matter, that a letter had indeed been found in the late vicar's study, tucked within the pages of his own prayer book, in which a Mr. Simon Ashworth had written, in terms Palk described as very strong indeed, that he would see his uncle answer for it one way or another, if the loan he had requested were not forthcoming by the end of the month. Miss Marple thanked the constable very kindly and asked to see the letter, and was permitted, after some little persuasion, to examine it briefly in his presence. She read it through twice, in silence, her expression giving away nothing at all of what passed behind it, and then, setting it down upon the table with the same careful, unhurried composure with which she did everything, she said, "How very curious, Constable, that a man so evidently in the habit of losing his temper on paper should have chosen, on this one occasion, to write in a hand so entirely unlike his own." Chapter 6. The Sisters' Silence. Constable Palk had not, it must be said, received Miss Marple's observation about the letter with very much grace. He had reddened and blustered a little, and said something about handwriting being a notoriously unreliable science, and best left to the proper authorities in Maidstone, and had taken the letter away again with the air of a man who intends to think no more about the matter, which was, Miss Marple reflected, watching him go, very often the precise moment at which a small and inconvenient truth becomes most dangerous, since it has been noticed and dismissed, and will therefore be looked for by no one at all in the days that follow. She had not pressed the point. It was not, she had found over a long lifetime, generally productive to press a point with a young constable who has already decided what he thinks, Far better to let the seed lie quiet in the ground. And besides, her mind that afternoon was a good deal more urgently engaged with another thread altogether. The thread that led, however faintly, from a dying colonel's confession to a name spoken 45 years before, and from that name to a woman who moved through the vicarage with such careful, deliberate unremarkableness that Miss Marple had begun to suspect the unremarkableness itself was the most remarkable thing about her. It was Dolly, once again, who furnished the next piece of the puzzle, quite without meaning to. For Dolly's great usefulness in such matters, Miss Marple had come to feel, lay precisely in her complete absence of discretion, which caused information to flow through her drawing-room with all the unimpeded freedom of water finding its own level. "Miss Carrow," Dolly said, over their sherry. A sherry Miss Marple still found herself regarding, quite irrationally, with a faint and lingering unease. "Old Agatha Carrow, up at Rose Cottage. You'll have passed it, Jane. The one with the dreadful monkey puzzle tree. Elizabeth's sister, Elizabeth Carrow that was, who died, oh, it must be 20 years since, of a chill she never should have caught, though there were those who said at the time it was a broken heart quite as much as a chill, poor thing, though nobody would ever say precisely why the heart had broken, since it was all hushed up so very thoroughly at the time." She said this with the particular relish of a woman circling, with evident enjoyment, the edges of a scandal she does not quite possess the details of, and is determined to obtain them regardless. "Agatha's frightfully sharp-tongued, always was, and hasn't had a kind word to say about the vicar in years, though for the life of me I never could discover why, since he was perfectly civil to her at every parish function I ever witnessed." Miss Marple, who had learned to treat any sentence beginning with the words "it was all hushed up so very thoroughly" as an invitation rather than a conclusion, called upon Miss Agatha Carrow the following afternoon, and found her exactly as advertised. A spare, upright woman of perhaps 70, with a face that had settled, over the years, into an expression of permanent and well-rehearsed disapproval, and a small, dim sitting-room, crowded with the sort of ornaments that suggest a life lived largely in the company of the past. "You'll be the one staying with Dolly Bantry," Agatha Carrow said, before Miss Marple had properly seated herself, in the manner of a woman who has already, through whatever channels the village employed, learned everything she required to know about her visitor, and intends to save them both the trouble of pretending otherwise. "And you'll be here about the vicar, I dare say, same as everyone else in this wretched village this fortnight, wanting to pick over a dead man's bones and call it Christian charity." She said it without particular heat, more in the tone of a woman stating a fact she has grown too tired to resent any longer. "Well, you may ask what you like. I'll not promise to answer it." "I should not dream of asking anything you did not wish to tell me, Miss Carrow," said Miss Marple, with perfect truth, settling herself into the offered chair. "I had only heard, and you must forgive an old woman's idle curiosity, for I fear it grows worse rather than better with age, that you had known the vicar a very long time, and did not, perhaps, share the general opinion of him that the rest of the village seems so devoted to." Something moved behind Agatha Carrow's guarded face. Not quite surprise, but the flicker of a woman who has been braced for one sort of attack and finds herself confronted, instead, with something altogether more oblique, and therefore harder to defend against. "General opinion," she said, with a short, hard laugh, "is a very cheap commodity, Miss Marple, and this village has never yet stinted itself in the spending of it. They'll tell you Michael Ashworth was a saint, kind to the poor, gentle with the sinners, never a harsh word for anybody. She looked down at her hands, folded tight in her lap. They didn't know my sister. Elizabeth, said Miss Marple, very gently. Agatha Carrow's head came up sharply. You've been talking to somebody. Only to an old man who has, I think, a very great deal on his conscience, and very little time left to set it down, said Miss Marple, with a quietness that seemed, somehow, to disarm the other woman more thoroughly than any direct accusation could have done. I do not ask you to betray your sister's memory, Miss Carrow. I ask only whether there is anything in her history, anything at all, that might help me understand why a man so universally loved should have been murdered in his own study, with his own door standing open as it always did. For a long moment Agatha Carrow said nothing at all, and the small dim room seemed to hold its breath along with her. The ornaments on the mantelpiece, Miss Marple noticed, in the way she noticed such things, a great many photographs of a young, laughing woman who could only have been Elizabeth, and none whatever, in any frame, of any child, standing silent witness to whatever calculation was passing behind the old woman's guarded eyes. There was a child, she said at last, in a voice gone suddenly flat and toneless, as though she had rehearsed the saying of it so many times in private that the words had worn smooth of any feeling. 45 years ago. Elizabeth was barely 20, and foolish, and in love with a man who hadn't the courage to stand by her. And when it could no longer be hidden, it was the vicar, the old vicar, Michael's predecessor, though Michael was curate here even then, quite young himself, who arranged everything, quietly, decently, as such things go. She went away to have the child, and came back 6 months later, and never spoke of it again, not once, not even to me, though I was her own sister, and slept in the next room to hers, for 30 years afterward. Her voice caught, very slightly, on the word afterward. I don't know what became of the child. I never knew, and Elizabeth never told me, and when she died, I thought whatever there was to know had died with her. And the father? Miss Marple asked, though she thought, by now, she already knew the answer. Agatha Carrow's mouth thinned into a hard, bitter line. She never named him. Not to me, not to anyone. But I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, for whatever use it is to you now, and here her voice dropped and hardened into something very like an old and carefully nursed hatred. I saw them together, once, before it all came out. Elizabeth and a young man from one of the better families hereabouts, walking in the water meadows where they thought nobody would see them. I never told a soul. I've carried it 30 years and watched him prosper in this village, respected, admired, growing old in comfort, while my sister died of a broken heart nobody was ever permitted to name. And if you're asking me whether I grieve for Michael Ashworth, who helped to cover the whole business up and keep that man's reputation safe at my sister's expense, then no, Miss Marple, I do not. She stopped, breathing rather hard, as though the confession had cost her a good deal more than she had expected it to. Miss Carrow, Miss Marple said, very carefully, when your sister's child was given up, do you know whether it was a boy or a girl? A girl, said Agatha Carrow, and something in her old, hard face cracked, just for a moment, into something that looked very much like grief. Elizabeth told me that much, at least before she'd sealed herself up entirely. A girl. She never even let herself say the name they'd chosen for her, not once, in 30 years. Though I found it once, written in the back of her prayer book, in her own hand, the year before she died, as though she couldn't help but set it down somewhere, even if she could never bring herself to speak it aloud. Miss Marple's hands, folded in her lap, went very still. "And what was the name, Miss Carrow?" Agatha Carrow looked at her for a long moment and then said, quietly, "Diana." Chapter 7. The Bracelet in the Sewing Box. She did not sleep well that night, though she said nothing of it to Dolly, who would only have prescribed a hot posset and worried a great deal more than the situation, in Miss Marple's private estimation, actually warranted. It was not fear that kept her wakeful, but the particular restlessness of a mind that has been given nearly all the pieces of a pattern and cannot yet persuade them to lie still together. For a name spoken twice, by two people who had never met one another and had no reason whatever to conspire in the telling of it, was not proof, however strongly it inclined the judgment. And Miss Marple had lived a long time on the principle that a conviction arrived at too quickly is very often a conviction that has skipped some essential and inconvenient step along the way. It was, therefore, with a genuine sense of purpose beneath her outwardly idle manner that she presented herself at the vicarage 2 mornings later, in answer to a general appeal, relayed through Mrs. Pettigrew, who seemed to have appointed herself unofficial mistress of ceremonies for the whole sad business of the vicar's effects, for any ladies of the parish willing to assist in sorting the late Reverend's personal belongings before the new incumbent's arrival. It was the sort of task Miss Marple had performed a great many times in a great many houses over the years, and she had found it, on each occasion, to be quite extraordinarily instructive. For a dead man's possessions, sorted and handled by the living, who remain to dispose of them, will very often tell a more truthful story than any of the living care to tell themselves. The vicarage, in the pale morning light, had already begun to acquire the faintly diminished air of a house whose occupant is no longer expected to return to it. The study door, standing open upon a room now stripped of its more valuable books, the hall table bare of the small accumulated clutter of a working life. Diana Wren moved through it all with the same quiet competence she had shown from the first, directing the disposal of linens, the packing of crockery, the setting aside of parish papers for the diocesan authorities, and if there was, in her manner that morning, any particular unease, Miss Marple could detect nothing of it in her face or in the steadiness of her hands. It was in the small sewing room off the kitchen passage, a room Diana had evidently used as her own private province these 15 years, its shelves lined with neatly labelled tins of buttons and thread, its single window looking out over the kitchen garden, that Miss Marple found herself, by the sort of accident that is not, perhaps, entirely an accident, left alone for some minutes while Diana went to see about tea for the working party. She had not gone there to pry. She told herself this quite firmly, even as her eye fell upon the sewing box standing open upon the little table by the window. Its contents disturbed, she thought, by the recent business of sorting through the room's effects for anything that might belong properly to the parish rather than to the housekeeper herself. And it was there, tucked beneath a folded length of grey wool and a card of buttons, that she saw it. A small, tarnished bracelet, of the sort given to infants at their christening, its silver gone dull and soft with age, its tiny clasp long since ceased to fasten properly. Miss Marple picked it up with the same careful, unhurried movement she brought to all such discoveries, and turned it toward the light from the window, and read, engraved upon its narrow band, in letters worn nearly smooth with handling, two initials that were not. She noted this with a small, cold certainty that settled somewhere beneath her ribs. The initials D.W. at all, but E.C. Elizabeth Carrow. She had barely time to register the full weight of what she held before she became aware of a presence in the doorway behind her, and turned to find Diana Wren standing quite still upon the threshold, a tea-tray forgotten in her hands, her eyes fixed upon the small tarnished object in Miss Marple's palm, with an expression that had, for once, entirely escaped her habitual control. It was not merely fear, Miss Marple thought, watching her, though fear was certainly present, plain and unmistakable in the sudden pallor of her face. It was something older than fear, something that had the quality of grief long buried and unexpectedly disturbed, and beneath even that, something Miss Marple could only afterward describe to herself as hunger, the look of a woman glimpsing, for one unguarded instant, something she has wanted with her whole starved heart for the whole of a very long life, and does not know whether she is permitted, even now, to reach for it. "That belonged to my mother," Diana said, and her voice, though low, had lost entirely the flat, competent evenness Miss Marple had come to expect of it. "I have always kept it. I don't know why you should be interested in an old woman's keepsakes, Miss Marple." "It is a christening bracelet, Miss Wren," said Miss Marple, gently, setting the tray she had taken from Diana's suddenly unsteady hands upon the table. "And christening bracelets, as I understand the custom, are given to the child that is christened, and not, generally, kept by the mother for her own use afterward. I wonder very much whose child this was, if it was not, perhaps, your own." The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely from any that had passed between them before, not the polished, impenetrable silence of a woman schooled in discretion, but the silence of someone standing at the very edge of a decision she has spent a lifetime avoiding, and finding, quite suddenly, that the ground beneath her has given way regardless of her own consent. "You've been talking to people," Diana said at last, very quietly. "The Colonel, Agatha Carrow. I saw you go up to the Grange, and I heard, from Mrs. Trent, that you'd called on Rose Cottage." She sat down, with great care, as though it required the whole of her remaining composure to do so without dropping it, the small pile of linen she had been carrying. I suppose it was too much to hope that an old woman with nothing better to do would content herself with her knitting. "I have never yet," said Miss Marple, "found knitting to be a satisfactory substitute for the truth, Miss Wren, or should I say, Miss Carrow, for I think that is very much closer to your rightful name, though I do not imagine you have used it since you were a very small child indeed, if you ever knew it to use at all." Diana Wren, for it was, Miss Marple now felt entirely certain, the only name by which the woman had permitted herself to be known for a very long time, whatever name had once been written upon a scrap of paper and folded away with a child she had never been permitted to keep, stood very still in the doorway of the small, cluttered room that had been, for 15 years, the only corner of the world she could properly call her own, and said nothing at all. And it was in that silence, more than in any words that might have followed it, that Miss Marple understood, with a sudden and sorrowful completeness, precisely how long and how carefully and at what cost this particular unremarkable woman had built the quiet, invisible life within which she had chosen, or perhaps simply been forced by circumstance and fear, to disappear. "I think," Miss Marple said, very gently, into the silence, "that you had better sit down, my dear, and tell me exactly what the vicar knew, and exactly what he intended to do about it, for I do not believe, whatever else may be true, that you came to Little Poldean 15 years ago by any accident at all." Chapter 8. The Missing Pages. Diana did not sit, though Miss Marple had suggested it. She remained standing by the window, very upright, her hands folded before her in the manner of a woman bracing herself against a physical blow, and when she spoke at last, it was in a voice scraped almost bare of the careful evenness that had served her so long and so well. "I came here 15 years ago because I had spent the whole of my life before that wondering who I was," she said, "and because I had learned, quite by accident, going through some old parish records in another county entirely, that a child born to an Elizabeth Carow of Little Poldean had been given up in circumstances the record described only as arranged privately, with the assistance of the incumbent. I was 30 years old, Miss Marple, and I had grown up believing myself unwanted, passed from one indifferent household to another, told nothing, asked nothing, and when I found that name, that place, I could not stay away from it, whatever the risk. I came here under another name. I took the position of housekeeper because it gave me a reason to be near him, near the one man alive who might know the truth of where I had come from, without ever having to say who I was, or why I had come, or risk being turned away a second time by people who had already once decided I was better given away than kept. "And did he know you?" Miss Marple asked, very gently. "Did the vicar recognize you, all those years ago, when you first came to his door?" "Not at first." Diana's voice caught, very slightly, on the memory. "It was more than a year before he came to suspect it, and longer still before I could bring myself to confirm it to him directly. He was kind about it, kinder, I think, than I had any right to expect, given that it was his own predecessor, and indirectly himself, who had arranged the whole business in the first place. He told me he had wondered, almost from my first month in his household, why a woman with my particular bearing and manner should have chosen so quiet and obscure a position. He said I did not carry myself like a woman who had spent her whole life in service, and he was quite right, though I had worked very hard indeed to make it seem otherwise." She drew a long, unsteady breath. "He promised me he would never speak of it to anyone unless I wished it, and for 14 years he kept that promise absolutely. And this past fortnight," Miss Marple said, watching her closely, "he told you he no longer intended to keep it." Something in Diana's face closed, very suddenly, like a door drawn quietly to. "He told me the colonel was dying," she said, "and that a dying man had asked him to find the daughter he had never had the courage to claim, and that he believed, Miss Marple, with all his gentle, meddling conviction that everything broken could be mended if only the truth were finally spoken, that it would bring healing to us both, to be reunited before it was too late." Her hands, folded before her, had begun very slightly to tremble. He did not ask my permission. He informed me of his intention, as a kindness, 3 days before he meant to carry it out. And then he went up to the Grange, that very evening, to prepare the colonel to receive me, and came home, I am told, looking unburdened, as though he had done something wonderful. Her voice had dropped, by the end, to something very close to a whisper. I do not know what happened to him that night, Miss Marple. I did not kill him. Whatever else you may believe of me, you must believe that. Miss Marple said nothing to this directly, for she had learned, over a very long life, that a denial offered too readily and too soon was worth examining a great deal more closely than one wrung out reluctantly after a long silence, and instead asked, with the same unhurried gentleness, "Did you know, Miss Wren, that the vicar kept a private diary, a record, I am told, of the confessions entrusted to him over the whole course of his ministry here?" Diana's eyes flickered, just perceptibly. "I knew he kept some sort of private record. He never showed it to me, nor to anyone, so far as I am aware." "Then I think," said Miss Marple, rising at last from her chair with the small, deliberate care of a woman a good deal older than she generally troubled to appear, "that it is high time someone looked at it properly." She found Constable Palk in the study, engaged in the melancholy business of boxing up the vicar's papers for the diocesan archive, and it took very little persuasion. A matter, chiefly, of reminding him that the inquest remained officially adjourned, and that any material bearing upon the vicar's state of mind in his final days might yet prove material to it, to obtain his permission to examine the desk's contents herself. The diary, when she found it, tucked beneath a stack of sermon notes in the bottom drawer, was a slim, unassuming volume, bound in worn black leather, its pages close written in a small, careful hand that grew, toward the more recent entries, noticeably less steady. But when she turned to the final pages, she found only a ragged, deliberate absence where several leaves had been, not torn out, as a hasty or panicked hand might have done, but cut, cleanly and precisely, close against the binding, with what could only have been a very sharp knife and a very steady hand indeed. "Someone did not want this read," Miss Marple murmured, half to herself, running her finger along the neat, telltale edge, and someone, moreover, who took a great deal of care over the manner of its removal, which tells us, I think, Constable, that whoever did this was not acting in panic, but according to a plan already very carefully considered. It was Constable Palk himself, oddly enough, casting about the room with the restless energy of a man anxious to be seen doing something useful, who noticed the hymn book, a plain, well-worn copy of Hymns Ancient and Modern, lying somewhat oddly upon the corner of the desk, apart from the vicar's other, more scholarly volumes, as though it had been consulted very recently and never returned to its proper shelf. "That's queer," he said, picking it up. "Man's own hymn book, on his desk, not in the pew where you'd expect it." He turned it over, frowning, and as he did so a loose leaf of paper, folded small and tucked within the back flyleaf where the binding had come slightly away from the boards, slipped free and fell to the floor between them. Miss Marple bent, with rather more speed than her 70-odd years generally permitted her, and retrieved it before the constable's larger, clumsier hands could reach it, and unfolding it there, in the pale grey light of the vicar's abandoned study, she found herself reading, in the same small, careful, increasingly unsteady hand, that had filled the diary's earlier pages what could only have been the very last entry the Reverend Michael Ashworth had ever set down. "I have told Dee what I mean to do," it read, "and I have seen in her face something I did not expect to see, and did not, I think, have any right not to have anticipated. I believed, in my foolishness, that the truth, however long withheld, must always in the end be a mercy. I am no longer entirely certain of this. I am afraid, and I set this fear down here, where I trust it will be found only if my own courage should prove, in the days ahead, to have been sorely misplaced, that the person I meant to save might not survive being saved. If anything should happen to me before this is set right, let whoever reads this know that I do not lay the blame at her door, whatever she may yet be driven to. I loved her as my own, from the moment I first suspected the truth of her, and I go to the Colonel tomorrow only because I could not bear, at the last, to leave her carrying alone a burden I had some part in placing there." Miss Marple read it through twice, in a silence broken only by the small, uneven sound of Constable Palk's breathing at her shoulder, and when she looked up at last, it was with the particular, sorrowful stillness of a woman who has just understood, entirely and all at once, not merely who had done a terrible thing, but why, and who finds that the why, on this occasion, is very nearly the hardest part of the whole dreadful business to bear. Chapter 9. What the Vicar Knew. She did not show the letter to Constable Palk in its entirety. It was, she told him, with a firmness that brooked no argument, a private matter touching upon the vicar's pastoral confidences, and ought properly to be examined first by someone with the discretion to understand its full weight before it was carried off to Maidstone and made the property of strangers. And Palk, who had by now come to regard Miss Marple with a wary respect he could not entirely account for, allowed himself, after a good deal of shuffling protest, to be persuaded. She sat with it a long while, alone in the vicarage garden where she had first sat 2 Sundays before, watching the light go copper and then grey over the churchyard wall, and read it through a 3rd time, and a 4th, until she had it very nearly by heart. And it was not, she found, the confirmation of Diana's parentage that troubled her most in the reading of it, that she had, by now, all but certainly established through her own patient inquiries, but the tenderness of it, the plain, unguarded love in a dying man's final written words for the woman he must by then have already begun to fear had poisoned him. "I loved her as my own, from the moment I first suspected the truth of her." He had known, or half known, even as he wrote it, what she might be driven to, and he had gone to the Colonel anyway, the very next evening, because he could not bear to leave her carrying the weight of her own concealment one day longer than kindness required. It was, Miss Marple thought, precisely the sort of gentle, well-meaning, catastrophic misjudgment that a truly good man might make. For Michael Ashworth had believed, with his whole simple heart, that truth was always and everywhere a mercy, and had never quite understood that a mercy offered without the consent of the person it is meant to save is very often experienced, by that person, as nothing more than another door being opened onto a room they had spent a lifetime trying to keep shut. She rose at last, when the light had gone almost entirely, and walked the short distance to the vicarage kitchen, where she found Diana Wren alone, seated at the great scrubbed table, with her hands folded before her, and an expression of such perfect, exhausted stillness that Miss Marple understood at once, before a single word had passed between them, that the woman had been sitting there for a very long time, waiting, though for what, precisely, Miss Marple did not think even Diana herself could yet have said. She set the bracelet down upon the table between them, gently, and beside it the small folded square of paper bearing the vicar's last written words, and drew out the chair across from Diana's own, and sat. "I have read what he wrote," Miss Marple said, "and I think, my dear, that you had better tell me the whole of it now, in your own words, rather than let me piece it together from fragments handed to me by other people. It will go better for you, I believe, if the truth comes first from you." Diana looked at the letter for a long moment without touching it, and Miss Marple saw her throat move once, convulsively, as though she were swallowing something a great deal larger and more painful than mere words. "He didn't understand," she said at last, and her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very tired, as though the whole elaborate structure of her composure had at last simply worn through, like cloth handled too many times in the same place. "He thought he was giving me a gift, a father, a family, a name at last, after 45 years of being nobody in particular. He couldn't understand that I had built my whole life, every single stone of it, on not being found. That being unremarkable was the only safety I had ever known." Her hands, still folded on the table, had begun, very slightly, to shake. "Do you know what it is, Miss Marple, to spend your childhood being handed from one household to another, always told you were fortunate to be taken in at all, always understanding, without anyone quite saying it, that you were a burden somebody else had once been glad to set down? And then to find, at 30, that you were not unwanted after all, that you had been given away out of love, out of protection, by people too frightened or too proud to keep you, and to know that you could never claim any of it, because the claiming would destroy the very people who had loved you enough to let you go. So you came here," Miss Marple said gently, "and you watched, from as close as you dared, and you never asked for anything at all." "I asked for nothing," Diana said. "For 15 years. I only wanted to know, to see my father's face, once, even from a distance, to understand where I had come from, so that I might finally stop feeling like a person who had simply arrived, out of nowhere, belonging to no one." Her voice cracked, at last, on the word nowhere. And then Michael decided, out of kindness, out of his terrible, well-meaning kindness, that I ought to have more than that. That I ought to have a father, a family, a public name, after a whole lifetime of being taught that such things were not for me. And he never once asked whether I wanted it. He only told me what he intended to do, as though the wanting of it were not even a question that required my answer. "And so you were afraid," Miss Marple said very quietly, "not of being unloved, but of being seen, of the whole village learning, all at once, exactly who you were and where you had come from, and looking at you, from that day forward, with pity, or with curiosity, or with the particular cruelty villages reserve for scandals, 30 years buried, and suddenly, unwillingly, exhumed." "I was afraid," Diana said, and now the tears came at last, silent and terrible, sliding down a face that had held itself so rigidly composed for a fortnight that Miss Marple felt, watching them fall, something very close to grief of her own. That the Colonel's family, his real family, his legitimate children, the ones who had every right to him that I never had, would turn on me the moment they learned the truth, before he had even the chance to die in peace. I was afraid of losing the only quiet, careful, invisible life I had ever managed to build for myself. In exchange for a public shame I had no power to control the shape of. And when Michael told me he meant to go to the Colonel that very week, whatever I wished, I understood, all at once, that the only door in this whole village I had ever truly trusted, his door, always open, always safe, had become, without my ever intending it, the one door I could not bear to walk through. She stopped and pressed both hands, briefly, over her face, and when she lowered them again, her eyes met Miss Marple's directly, for the first time since the conversation had begun, with an expression that held, in equal and terrible measure, both a lifetime's exhaustion and something that looked very much like relief at having, at last, nothing further left to hide. "Won't you tell me your name?" Miss Marple said, very softly. "Your real one, the one your mother gave you, before she ever had to give you away." For a long moment Diana did not answer, and then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, she said, "Diana." It was Diana, after all, Miss Marple. She never changed her mind, even in 30 years of never speaking it aloud. I have always been, exactly who you think I am. Chapter 10. The Open Door. The confession, when it came at last, came not in the kitchen, where the truth had first been spoken, but in the garden beyond it, as the light was failing over the churchyard wall, in the same slow, honeyed manner it had failed on that first evening, a fortnight before, when Miss Marple had sat with her idle knitting and listened to Dolly speak, with such comfortable unconcern, of a door that was never locked. Diana had asked, in a voice gone very small, whether they might walk outside a little before anything further was decided. "For I find I cannot say the rest of it indoors, Miss Marple, in a house so full of him still." And Miss Marple, who understood a great deal about the need for open air when a soul is preparing to set down something it has carried a long way, had agreed, and sent word by the gardener's boy that Constable Palk should be asked to wait a little while yet before coming up to the vicarage. They walked slowly along the gravel path between the roses, which the vicar himself had planted, Diana said, in his first year in the parish, and had tended with his own hands every summer since, and it was there, with the last light draining slowly out of the sky, and the rooks settling into the churchyard limes with their evening conversation, exactly as they had done on the night he died, that Diana Wren told Miss Marple, quietly and without theatrics, precisely what had happened. "He asked me to bring him his sherry that last evening, as I always did," she said. "It was the smallest thing in the world, Miss Marple, the most ordinary act of a 15-year routine. I had done it 1,000 times before. I knew exactly where the decanter stood, and exactly how much he took, and exactly how long it would be before Mrs. Trent's boy came round with the evening post, and I would have some reason to be seen elsewhere in the house, so that no one would think it strange I was not with him when—" She stopped, and drew a long, unsteady breath, and went on. "I had thought about it for 3 days, only thought about it, you understand. I told myself, right up until that very evening, that I would never actually do it, that I was only turning the possibility over in my mind, the way one turns over a stone one has no intention of throwing. And then he called me in to tell me, quite gently, quite kindly, that he had settled everything with the Colonel, that a meeting had been arranged, that within the week the whole of Little Poldean would know precisely who Diana Wren really was. And I understood, all at once, standing there with the decanter still in my hand, that he was never going to be persuaded otherwise, that his kindness on this one point was entirely immovable. And I put the powder in, and I gave him his glass, and I sat with him for a little while afterward, talking of nothing at all, while I waited to see whether I had really, truly done what I had told myself for 3 days I would never do. She stopped walking then, and stood very still in the gathering dusk, her face turned away toward the dark bulk of the church tower. He thanked me, Miss Marple, for the sherry. Those were very nearly the last words he ever said to me. An ordinary word of thanks, the kind he had said to me 10,000 times before, and I stood there and received it knowing what I had done, and I have not, since that night, been able to think of a single moment in which I might have stopped myself and did not. Miss Marple listened to all of this in silence, her hands folded before her, and when Diana had finished, she said, at last, very gently, "I do not think, my dear, that you killed him because you wished him dead. I think you killed him because you were more afraid of being known than you had ever, in your whole life, permitted yourself to be afraid of anything else. And fear, when it has been carried alone for long enough, in silence, without ever once being set down and examined in the light, will very often do things that love itself would never countenance." She paused. "It was, I think, the very quality that made you so valuable to him and to this whole village, your carefulness, your self-effacement, your gift for making yourself so entirely unremarkable that no one ever troubled to wonder what lay beneath it, that made you, in the end, capable of doing something so very carefully and so very quietly that even a poisoning could pass, for 3 whole days, as nothing more than a tired heart giving out at the end of an ordinary evening." "You knew," Diana said, "almost from the first, I think. I saw it in your face, that very first afternoon, when I told you I had done my duty and would miss him. You knew there was something wrong in the shape of my grief." "I suspected," Miss Marple corrected her gently, "which is a very different thing from knowing, and a great deal less comfortable, for a suspicion unproven is a burden one must carry about with one everywhere, wondering all the while whether one has done a grave injustice to an innocent, grieving woman. Real grief, my dear, is rarely so tidy as yours appeared that first afternoon. It forgets to pour the tea, it weeps at the wrong moment, and fails to weep at the right one, and generally makes rather more of a mess of itself than propriety allows. Yours was schooled to a degree I have very seldom seen outside of women who have spent their whole lives being taught that their own feelings were an inconvenience to somebody else, and had better be kept carefully out of the way." She paused, watching the last light fade from the sky. "And then there was the hymn, at the funeral. You did not weep once, the whole service through, and I marked it, and thought it strange in a woman so evidently devoted to her late master, until the christening hymn was sung, quite by chance, the vicar having left instructions for it long before, and I saw you flinch, Miss Wren, as though you had been struck. Grief for an employer does not flinch at a christening hymn. Only grief for something a great deal more personal does that." Diana closed her eyes. "I did not think anyone had seen. I make it my particular business," said Miss Marple, not unkindly, "to see the things that are not meant to be seen. It is not, I fear, a very charming quality in an old woman, but it has occasionally proved useful." She was silent a moment, and then said, with a gentleness that did not in the least diminish the gravity of what followed, "You must go to Constable Palk now, my dear, and tell him what you have told me. There is no other way through this that does not, in the end, do a further injustice to somebody, to Simon Ashworth, whose foolish letter was made to look a great deal worse than it was, to the Colonel, who has spent 45 years believing himself the author of every wrong in this story, and does not deserve to carry your guilt on top of his own, and to Michael Ashworth himself, whose last act on this earth was an act of love, however badly judged, and who does not deserve to be remembered, in the end, as a man whose death was permitted to remain a mystery. He wanted me to have a family," Diana said, very low, the tears coming again, silently, in the dark. "He never understood that I already thought of him as the only family I had ever truly had, that I did not need a father's name or a place in some other family's history, so long as I had his door, always open, always safe, waiting for me at the end of every ordinary day. He took that from me, without ever meaning to, in trying to give me something he thought would be better." She turned to Miss Marple at last, her face wet and stripped, in the near darkness, of every last trace of the careful composure she had worn for a fortnight like armour. "Will you tell my father, the Colonel? Must he know what I did?" Miss Marple considered this for a long moment, watching the last light die entirely from the sky above the church tower, and when she answered, it was with the particular, weighted gentleness of a woman who has thought very carefully about the true cost of every possible kindness. "I think," she said, "that the Colonel has spent 45 years being protected from painful truths by people who believed they were sparing him for his own good, and I think that protection, however lovingly intended, has cost him a very great deal more than the truth itself ever could have. He is dying, my dear, and dying men are entitled, I believe, to know the whole of their own history before the end. Not because the knowing will not hurt him, for I think it will hurt him very much indeed, but because a lifetime spent in ignorance of the truth is not, in the end, a mercy at all. It is only another version of the very silence that brought us all to this garden tonight." She reached out and took Diana's cold, trembling hand in both of her own. "You have spent your whole life believing that love and secrecy were the same thing, that to protect someone was to keep them always, carefully, in the dark. But a door left open, my dear, means nothing at all if the heart behind it remains closed." Michael understood that, in the end, however clumsily he acted upon it. "I think it is time, now, that you understood it too." They walked back together, through the dark garden, to where Constable Palk waited, uncertain and a little afraid of what he was about to be told. In the lit doorway of the vicarage kitchen, the same door that had stood open, unremarked and unremarkable, through every ordinary evening of the 15 years Diana Wren had spent in that house, waiting for a truth she had never quite found the courage to walk toward on her own. It was some weeks later, when the whole sad business had at last been settled, quietly, as such things generally are in villages that have already had quite enough excitement for one autumn, and are anxious to return to the ordinary business of church fetes and flower rotas, that Miss Marple sat once more in Dolly Bantry's garden, her knitting once again idle in her lap, and looked out over the darkening lawn toward the church tower, just visible above the hedgerow, its bells ringing the ordinary hour with the same patient indifference they had rung for several centuries before, and would, in all likelihood, continue to ring for several centuries yet. "It is a very sad story, Jane," Dolly said, refilling their glasses. "The saddest I think I have ever heard in all my years in this village. A good man dead, and a woman who might have been perfectly happy, in her quiet way, driven to ruin herself entirely rather than let her secret be spoken aloud." "It is a very common story, I think, dear, for all its sadness," said Miss Marple, gazing at the last light fading from the sky. "There is very little in this world so dangerous in the end as a secret kept out of love. We tell ourselves we are protecting the people we care for, when very often we are only protecting ourselves from the discomfort of being fully known by them. And the longer such silence is permitted to grow, the more terrible a shape it takes, until at last it can drive even a gentle heart to something it would never, in the ordinary way of things, have believed itself capable of." She resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the gathering dusk. "Michael Ashworth never locked his door, you know, because he believed that an open door was itself a kind of mercy, a standing invitation to the truth, however painful, over the false comfort of a closed one. He was right, I think, in the end, though it cost him his life to prove it. The tragedy was never the door left open, Dolly. It was that it took so very long, and so very much sorrow, for anyone inside that house to trust it enough to walk through.